From the first signs,
I just want to let you know your son is autistic. God, that was a bomb.
to the stress on parents and the reactions they encounter.
Take a pause before you pass judgment and assume here's a child who's not well behaved.
To what you should know.
I have autism, but that is not who I am.
It's the fastest growing developmental disability in the United States. WPTV presents an Impact 5 special, Autism, Connecting the Pieces.
Good evening and welcome. The number of cases of autism in this country growing. It is estimated that 1 in 88 children will be on the autism spectrum. Chances are increasing then that you will be coming in contact with an individual or family affected by autism. So tonight we're helping you understand more about autism and how it affects so many people directly and indirectly. We'll also be showing you the things you need to know when communicating with adults on the autism spectrum. We'll begin with a story about parents, how they often react when they learn their child's been diagnosed as being on the spectrum and the stages they go through.
Black arms, right?
5-year-old Efren Sanchez is energetic and enthusiastic in his kindergarten class at the Palm Beach School for Autism. He has come far in the 3 years since his dad received the call telling him of his diagnosis.
I just want to let you know your son is autistic. God, that was a bomb.
Like so many families, the reality of autism was jarring. The Sanchezes were forced to move into a different environment where the smallest accomplishment is a major milestone.
When we introduce him to friends, he looks at him, makes eye contact, which for us is like, wow, celebration.
When parents tell us their children make eye contact or say their first word, it's huge. Because to parents, that means the child's connecting. The child actually sees the parent. There's nothing worse for parents, especially in the pre-K age, when their children aren't making that connection.
Anne Levine Eisenberg is the school's executive director. As a parent of a child with autism and overseeing classrooms filled with students on the autism spectrum, she sees the many stages parents go through.
In the beginning, you're unsure, you don't really trust anybody, you're not really sure what direction your child's going to go. All your wishes and dreams for any parent, for any child, will they come true?
Efren is considered to be on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum.
What's on there? A mouth and what else? A nose. So go ahead and draw your mouth and nose.
He's displayed good cognitive and social skills.
2 legs, right? Right. Good job.
Now the question is, how much will he progress?
I just want him to be able to do the things that I did.
At this point, they can still hold on to a lot of those dreams.
Now joining me is Anne Levine Eisenberg. You saw her in our story, the executive director of the Palm Beach School for Autism and the mother of a 23-year-old son on the autism spectrum, and Rod Wetzel, the father of an 11-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, both on the autism spectrum. Since we began our Impact 5 coverage, a lot of people have said to us, it's hard for others to understand what it's like to have a child who's on the spectrum. Begin with your thoughts. What's the most central thing that you'd like people to know? Ann, we'll begin with you.
My goodness, I think a lot of patience. There's so much unknown out there about autism, so having patience and really appreciating where the parents are coming from. And don't be afraid to ask questions. I wore my heart on my sleeve. I told everybody about my son because I wanted people to be informed and educated. When you don't tell them, you get a lot of arrogance and a lot of misunderstanding.
Talk about the arrogance when you say that. What do you mean?
People just saying, why can't you just send him to his room? He's misbehaving. Or why can't you just tell him to be quiet? Or, you know, he just needs a good spanking. And those aren't true. He's not in control of his behaviors. That's the autism. And I think the general public needs to understand that. It's not my fault. I'm not a bad parent.
Rod?
I think, like she said, the perspective of everybody knowing your kid's autistic, at first it was hard, but I'd like everybody to know that it is there. And the hardest part also is, like she said, you know, people want you to correct your kid without even knowing what's going on. And the insurance part where it gets dropped back and forth, you know, they change the insurance on your kid's several times in a year.
Give people a little sense, again, for those who do not have a child on the spectrum, or perhaps those who don't know someone with a child on the spectrum, although given the statistics, that's an increasingly smaller group of people. But give them a sense of the stages. As you looked at your children, talk about the stages you go through. First, and you still have this, when the children are young, and then let's talk about when they get, say, 8 to 10, and then on to teenage and adult years. Talk about the child as a youngster first, what you're dealing with as a parent, what they're dealing with.
Well, when Kirsten was 3.5 years old, she didn't talk yet, but very smart, like do things on her own. And then I had a teacher down in Broward County actually come up to us and say, hey, you know, your daughter might be autistic. And I'm thinking, no way, not my kid. And so we actually went to the state and we had her checked out and we found out she was autistic.
But you'd seen no signs, at least in your mind, that indicated as such.
Right, from her not talking. And then when they tell you about your kid is autistic, that's when you're like...
It's a hammer blow.
Yeah, it's a hammer blow, but you don't know what it is. And then all of a sudden, you get thrown into it, so you start reading and naturally trying to do the best thing for your kid.
And then talk about from the perspective they move from youngsters where you're going to the physicians, you're trying to go to resources, you're trying to get speech therapy, you're trying to bring in all these therapies. Your child reaches sort of that middle level, say 5th to 7th grade. Talk about the perspective and the stages then.
It's a really another big hammer when the kids begin to transition into the middle school and the high school arena, because those wishes that you had when your child was little, well, maybe they'll still go to college, well, maybe they will have a family someday. When they hit about 5th grade, about 10, 11 years old, a lot of those wishes and maybe sort of fall to the wayside, and you have a wake-up call. You know, okay, where is my child truly now, and what direction do I need to go in?
One of the things parents talk to me about all the time is the strength of where they see the best resources being, but also the weaknesses. Both of you take us through the spectrum. For parents out there who may be new to the challenges of a child on the autism spectrum, or maybe in the middle of that lifelong challenge that all of you bring such courage to, talk about the resources that are available, but also the ones where we need to be doing more as a community and a country to focus. First, you.
I think the biggest resources right now I would direct parents are two. Autism Speaks, which is a national organization, an incredible amount of resources on the website. I encourage all of our parents who do call us for resources and support to go to Autism Speaks. And also the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities.
Out of Florida Atlantic University.
Out of Florida Atlantic University, or if you live in the northern end of the area, Treasure Coast, would be the Port St. Lucie.
So CARD, this is important. CARD, Center for Autism-Related Disabilities, and I see you, Rod, I want you to weigh in, I see you shaking your head here. I've had people tell me this is a tremendous resource.
Tremendous.
Both in South County and on the Treasure Coast.
Throughout the state of Florida.
Right, but speaking to our viewership primarily just for the moment, and talk about the resources they offer.
They offer an incredible amount of anything you need with regards to behavior direction, how to handle behavior. Diet information, support, a shoulder to cry on. There's a lot of tears that are shed when you have a child with autism.
Directing you to the therapies.
Directing you to therapy. They can't make recommendations, but they can certainly link you up to resources.
Right, they can vet you to the
Networking.
resources. I see you shaking your head. Have you used CARD as a resource for you and your family
yes,
and your
we
children?
have.
Talk about that.
Actually, my wife was geared more towards because of my work schedule, but she's done a lot, and without the resources, you would be lost. I mean, basically, you'd be thrown to wolves because your kids with autism have to have guidance and direction, and almost the same thing over and over. So, like, as times for holidays, it's very hard for like our family, and I'm sure other families too that have autistic kids, because when you're on a routine schedule and all of a sudden you have 4 days off, they get thrown for a big loop.
And talk to, you have that resource, Autism Speaks, and you can go to the website. Why don't you say that website right now? I think it's autismspeaks.org.
Yep.
And certainly you can go on at Autism Speaks and it will come up. Another tremendous resource. Where are the resource weaknesses that you see? What do we need to be doing more of? Now, of course, you all have a wonderful school working with children on the spectrum. Where educationally and resource-wise do you say this is where we've got to make some quantum leaps in the years ahead?
As the executive director of the Palm Beach School for Autism, I get all the first line and phone calls
Sure.
that come in from parents. And the biggest area of weakness for our area is we don't have certified behaviorists to be able to go into the home and help families out and really help structure the home so the child is more successful at home. Almost replicate what's going on in the school setting and have it happen in the house. Those supports to go home and go into the home are tremendously lacking because there's so many kids who need it.
Are we seeing any change in that?
Not yet.
Is the medical establishment, the diagnostic establishment, those involved in these therapies starting to move towards this reality? Or
It's really a matter of recruiting great certified behavioralists to come into this area.
as a dad, concretely, when you bring it down to the grassroots, what for you are the biggest educational and other resource challenges you face on a daily basis with your children?
I think education and the resources for classes for your kids.
Specific classes, are they in schools directly geared for children with autism,
Some.
or are they mainstreamed into other schools?
Some and some are mainstream, like my kids go to like speech therapy,
Sure.
stuff like that. But you need more of it because 4 hours a week, that's nothing.
We've talked about the numbers and this clarion call, 1 in 88 children in this country on the spectrum, and yet it still seems to so many that we're not there yet in realizing the enormity of the crisis we face not only now, but for decades and really lifetimes to come.
And that's my biggest fear is we have a lot of services for the young. What happens when they all graduate?
And I want to turn the mirror on us a little bit. We've done a lot of work with our Impact 5 segment this year. We'll be doing it all year long. At first, we focused a lot on people with younger children, and people have called and said, we're glad you're doing that, but what about the focus? And it's one of the things we're beginning to turn our focus to here at News Channel 5, to those when they're teenagers and adults. First, talk about the differences once those children hit puberty and then adulthood, and the brand new challenges we face with people who are now teen years or adults, as is your case, and how we as a community deal with that in terms of those resources and these people who are now adults.
We have to start dealing with it. That's the first thing I would say. We, as a community, were not ready for the influx of kids that are going to be graduating over the next 10 years with autism. We need to be ready. We need to have services. We need to have housing. We need to have safe transportation. We need to have jobs. And as a school, that's what we're beginning to look at is what happens when our students graduate at 22. What can we do?
Do we have anything that you say is at least the seed as a role model for the kind of things we'll need as adult resources?
We need great vocational programming. We need great social and recreational programming. We need safe housing for these adults.
As a dad looking at that adulthood, talk about that.
Yeah, within the past year and a half, my daughter was only 9 when she got her first, as you say, her first period.
Sure.
At 9 years old. And that's when it had dawned on my wife, I need to look for something there in the future for her. So she went ahead and started looking into it and started with insurance, like life insurance, stuff like that, in case something does happen.
I also you bring up insurance. If the number one thing I hear from people, or certainly in the top 3, is the insurance headaches of trying to get therapy covered, behavioral or speech or otherwise, an enormous fight for people. What challenges do you face, and are we making headway that you see as a parent and someone deeply involved as the executive director of a school in the vanguard of the movement, in terms of insurance? First, you, Rod.
It's funny you say that's a coincidence because in the last 3 days, Medicaid and the Children's Fund for Florida have switched my kids back and forth. So my wife's been on the phone. Does my daughter and my son still have speech? They still have therapy? Thank God that we're in pretty good with the people who do the therapy. So they're letting us go through till this thing gets settled. And it only takes about 2 weeks through the state.
But we need clarity in terms of insurance instead of the moving target that I hear people complain about all the time.
It used to be once a year you'd get updated. Now it seems like they're doing it monthly, which throws us through a loop. And you can't even really talk to anybody. You just get a letter in the mail saying, this is what your kid has now.
Ann?
I would say parents like Rod are luckier than I was because insurance back in the 90s didn't cover anything. Everything was out of pocket. People second mortgaged their home. They sold their engagement rings. Everything to be able to pay for therapies for my son. And there was very little services out in the community that you could be a part of. You had to pay for it yourself. So they're luckier, but there's no reason that any parent should have to spend 4 or 5 hours on the phone.
Closing thoughts, your biggest plea to lawmakers and to people out there who have not been impacted by children who are on the autism spectrum?
We need to pay attention to the adults that are about to embark on our county. We need to look at monies for vocational and for safe housing, and we need to improve our transportation system.
And as a dad to people, because so many people, and we see this all the time, they say we feel ostracized sometimes. We're not invited to go do the things others are. People don't have the patience. What's your plea? What's your message to this community?
I want everybody to know that autism is there, and it could happen to your kid. Get him checked. Because with my daughter, we found out kind of late, and I think with my son, I think he'll make bigger strides because we noticed it at a younger age.
And I know you're asking for more sensitivity from a community at large, where we can be an impatient community, more sensitivity to what you're dealing with as a parent.
Yeah, with your local politicians, I hope that's on one of their agendas in the upcoming elections in February.
Certainly so. So many resource issues, our year-long efforts trying to help scratch the surface and let people know what the issues are to get out there. Ann Levine Eisenberg, Rod Wetzel, we thank you for sharing a bit of your lives, a bit of the challenges, and a bit of the hopes as well. You both have tremendous courage, as so many in the autism community do. Thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Channel 5. Thank you, sir.
Coming up next, what you need to know when dealing with adults on the autism spectrum. Coming up, the best ways to interact with adults on the autism spectrum. But first, the cost of autism. Welcome back to our Impact 5 special on autism. Communicating with those on the autism spectrum can be a challenge, but we found one Boca Raton man who gave us suggestions because he knows the situation firsthand.
Well, you're a hard worker.
Sam Rogerson enjoys his role as an advisor.
Got it. Good job.
He's on the higher end of the autism spectrum, and now the 23-year-old has become a mentor to his friend, Scott Rubin.
It's a really perfect environment for me to working with kids with intellectual disabilities.
Every week, Sam and Scott take the train and then the bus to the all-tag office in Boca Raton. Here they work loading the tags that stores use to detect if clothing is being stolen.
All right, stick it in the box right there. There you go.
With his ability to work and supervise someone with autism, Sam provides a unique view of life on the autism spectrum. He says a big problem is understanding what others are saying. His advice: be direct.
Use small words and break it down into like little sentences and like slow down a little bit.
He says when talking with someone with autism, avoid everyday phrases.
Let's say if it's raining cats and dogs, a lot of people with autism get confused like by that. So the way to like help them describe what it means.
While working with Scott, Sam demonstrates another key to communicating: stick to the point.
Remember, you let all the air out before you close it.
He says it is easy to lose focus.
Let's say, for example, like 10 or 15 minutes, they talk for a long time and they give you some instructions like, Sam, I got instructions for you, number one, and the rest, and then moments later, when it gets too long, it goes blah, 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 and then pretty soon you start feeling like this.
But what he wants most of all is for people to understand that while he may be on the autism spectrum, it does not define him.
I have autism, but that is not who I am.
Now joining us, Allison Ballin, a board-certified behavior analyst who's been working in the autism field for the past 20 years. We thank you for taking time to come in and speak with us. We talked earlier in the broadcast, as people on the autism spectrum become teenagers, then young adults, communicating with them, corresponding with them, touching base, bringing them into a conversation, into the reality of your existence is so important. What are the key things you want people to know about how we do that and how we do it better?
Okay, one of the first things you want to always make sure is that you are interacting with them and targeting a topic of interest for them, making sure that you're engaging them in something that they want to talk about. if possible.
And I know you brought some key points. You've been doing this forever, but you're so passionate about
Yeah.
it, so feel free. I know you
Yeah.
brought a few points. That's how
Yes.
passionate you were,
Yes.
and you're a pro at this, but you said, I want to make sure I touch on all of these things, because it can be difficult, and people will sometimes say, because it is, I'm going to shy away from that. And yet, so many in our autism community have so very much to offer, but they
Right.
need people to have that give and take. So talk more about that.
So your tone is very important. You want to speak to any individual with autism the same way you would speak to anyone else their age. That's really important. You don't want to use baby talk. You don't want to slow down your speech. You want to speak to them the same way you would speak to anyone else. You want to simplify your language, but still have the same respect that you would speak to with anyone else.
Talk a little bit about, I think for people who are not familiar with those on the spectrum, there may be certain attitudes they have about it that are incorrect. Talk about that and how we need to break down those barriers and those bad assumptions.
Okay, so probably the biggest assumption is if they're not looking at you, that they're not paying attention to you. And that's definitely incorrect. And it's important for you to try to maintain and establish eye contact with them, but if they're not giving it back to you, that doesn't mean that they're not listening and that they're not able to communicate with you.
Are we starting to see among people in your line of work, Ann Levine Eisenberg talked about the fact we need more therapists of all sorts.
Sure.
We also need more vocational training and more people who are willing to have the patience to really elicit the talent and the drive and the desire of people on the spectrum. Are we beginning to see that? And what is a potential employer? What do we need to do to help elicit that, make sure we're doing our part to bring out the very best of their abilities and desires as they move into adult life?
Well, firstly, we want to always start young. So we start our kids thinking about what they're going to do at a very young age. And the way you do that is, like any other child, you focus on their strengths, what they love, what they're good at, and if it's something that can actually lead to a job or a career for them. And definitely, most important is focusing on their strengths as opposed to their weaknesses. That's key.
You have a few of the other key points you touched on. What are
Sure.
some of the other things you want our viewers to walk away with?
I think that you need to definitely give them a chance. You want to wait when you are posing a question to them or giving a direction or an instruction. You want to wait and give them time to process and respond. And you definitely want to keep your language as literal as possible. Avoid abstract if possible.
The autism spectrum, of course, is just that. There are those who are highly functional, able to communicate in a very clear way, others who are not. What do you say to parents whose child or young adult on the spectrum is less communicative, doesn't have that ability? How, as you said off camera to me, can you augment that so that you can have that kind of communication with them and allow them the opportunities they want as well?
So there's a lot of augmentation systems out there now.
Which means what?
An augmentative device is any kind of device, whether it be pictures, computers, voice output systems that can help augment communication.
Right.
They're
Tablets, smart tablets.
Now, I mean, it's the generation of that. So we're really fortunate with that. And training them to do it at a young age is really important.
Allison, I know people watching this are always saying, what's the best resource and the best piece of advice? So as you're talking to our viewers, what's the best advice you want to give them and the best resource you would turn people to in terms of the communication you've talked about?
I would most definitely recommend an AAC evaluation for your
AAC.
child. Assistive augmentative communication evaluation.
Ask your doctor or pediatrician about
You
that.
can
They can
ask-
direct you, or who do you
Yes,
go to?
they can start there. You can start there, and most definitely your speech pathologist. They're great with that.
And see where they are, and then your building blocks of communication come on top of that.
Yes.
But that's key.
Key, you have to know how they communicate, what type of communicator they are, if they're verbal, nonverbal, and what way to best aid them.
Allison Ballin has been working in this field for 20 years. We appreciate very much your expertise.
you.
I know that a lot of people so appreciate it, as do we. And we'll be back with more in just a moment. I want to offer special thanks to all our guests for being with us. It's part of our year-long effort to try to help you understand more about autism. We've created an entire section on WPTV.com devoted to those on the autism spectrum. You can find it by clicking on our Impact 5 link. You can read blogs written by parents and find the answers to frequently asked questions about autism. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We wish you a good night.
Thank you for watching WPTV News Channel 5. Count on the largest news team from Boca Raton to the Treasure Coast. On air, online, and on mobile. It's local coverage you can count on.